Moody's just downgraded China's credit, raising further concern, if you will, about the buildup of debt inside the Chinese economy, the amount of leverage that's supporting Chinese growth. You made your name calling out and shorting Chinese companies, mostly Chinese companies that traded in North America, but Chinese companies nonetheless. You spent some time in the country, you know it well, you've done some work on the macro thesis. What do you make of the downgrade, and what do you think China's prospects are?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's actually very difficult for me to be here in mid-2017 and seeing that this hasn't actually collapsed yet, or that we haven't had a serious unwind in China, because I've felt for many years that it's an enormous asset and credit bubble. And, you know, under the old orthodoxy, that couldn't be sustained that long. But if you look around the world, you see that, you know, the ECB, the Fed are helping to sustain kind of frothy asset valuations. Japan hasn't made sense in a few decades. So China, question is really how long can they keep it going? And I don't have a view on this. I think ultimately there will be a day of reckoning. I mean, I know that. I just can't tell you if it's 2 months, 2 years, or 20 years.
In other words, you don't have a view on the timing.
Correct.
But you do feel certain about the outcome.
Yeah, I mean, they've been...
Whenever it happens.
Yeah, they've been destroying value, destroying capital for so many years through their fixed asset investment. And, you know, the one cushion that China has, and this is something that there's a lot of debate about how bad, you know, how hard a landing you will get in China. The one cushion that it has is that it owns the banking system. So China's reaction to the financial crisis in '08 was to just cram liquidity into that banking system. But through almost non-existent controls, I would argue, that went straight into real estate domestically, and then a lot of it also fled the country, went into real estate and the West Coast and Canada and Australia as well. But there's been so much value destroyed that my firm belief is you cannot, at some point, your past sins catch up with you. Just don't know when that will be for China.
So if timing is impossible to predict, which, don't want to put words in your mouth, but sounds to me as though that's what you're saying, what about those people who've chosen to short China, whether it's through the Chinese currency or through other instruments? That sounds like the kind of trade that has lost people money in the Japanese government bond market for years, a widowmaker.
Right. Yeah, well, there's certainly ways that you can play China that are company specific. I mean, there are a lot of Chinese companies that are publicly traded, you know, some in the US, a lot in Hong Kong, and many of them are very poor quality. So I wouldn't want to take a purely macro thesis and say, well, I'm going to short China. I wouldn't want to short the Hang Seng Index. But I think, you know, if you start with the macro thesis and say there are a lot of credit problems in China, and then you start looking at industries that might be canaries in the coal mine, or companies that might be canaries in the coal mine, then you can get it right. The flip side, though, is there are companies that just won't be allowed to fail. I mean, there are companies that don't make sense on many levels that just somehow keep it going. And so understanding which companies, for whatever reason, have the guanxi, as they call it, to keep it going, that's challenging.
And what about the bull case? I'm not sure I would call it a raging bull case, but people say Xi Jinping is determined not to let the economy collapse, determined not to let credit consume, bad loans consume the banking system. They've started to crack down in select places. And to your point, the government does have a lot of control over the financial system and the economy. At the very least, maybe they'll muddle through.
Well, see, that's when, I always crack a smile when I hear Western trained economists say things like that, because it's this tremendous cognitive dissonance. Okay, so these are often the same economists who, the moment that the US government bought non-voting pref shares in banks to capitalize them, freaked out, saying, oh, this is horrible, it's the death of markets. A lot of the same economists then look at the Chinese leadership and say, in this quasi-command economy. Oh, this is brilliant. Well, you know what? These guys are no more capable, trust me, no more capable than our policymakers in the U.S. have been. And truth be told, as screwed up as our government seems at times, our government, the United States government, has the most power in the world to avert a major economic catastrophe. All right, so if they weren't able to do it, it's because the laws of economics, almost the physics of economics, eventually catch up. And no matter how brilliant Xi Jinping is, and by the way, pretty much everybody in the Chinese leadership is an engineer, which is, I'm not saying they should, staff their government full of lawyers, but there's a lot of intellectual, it's very incestuous intellectually. So I'm not going to bet that these guys can escape the laws of economics in perpetuity.